Wednesday, March 31st, 2021, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So what's the best way to fight the Federal Reserve or central banks in general? I've seen that George Gammon has started a Gofundme campaign to audit the Fed. It says George Gammon and Robert Barnes lay out their audit the Fed lawsuit strategy. It's time to sue the Fed under the Freedom of Information Act and the Fed. So I think any effort to expose the Federal Reserve is good. I see that they're looking to raise $100,000 and George Gammon has put up $25,000, which is very good, of course. So far, they've raised $46,254. I think this started yesterday, so it's doing quite well. So what are they exactly looking to do? And after we look into that, I'm going to give some ideas of how to fight the Fed. Well, not only the Federal Reserve, but all central banks. So it says here in the prospectus, if you want to call it that, since 1913, the Fed has destroyed the purchasing power of the dollar, distorted the economy, created malinvestment, and incentivized misallocation of resources that have crushed the American poor and middle class. Often, they've implemented their destructive policies, blatantly defying the document that legally binds them, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The poor and middle class end up paying the price for the Fed ignoring the law to create inflation, while the financial insiders and politicians get richer due to the Cantillon effect. Cantillon effect is, of course, the theory that inflation, which is the creation of money and credit out of thin air by government and central banks, first flows through the higher ladder of the economy, through to the wealthy, to the connected. Like a river, it goes into different places, right? It flows, and then towards the end, when the water is already dirty or the money is diluted, it flows to the masses, and by then the money is already debased, and that's how they extract wealth from the general public, the top 1%, so to speak. This is why we need to take legal action. We need to push back and show them they're not above the law. The Federal Reserve Act is meant to not only constrain the central planners, but protect us from them. So here are the simple, fast steps. Sue under FOIA, Freedom of Information. Audit Fed with documents received. File lawsuit for violation of Federal Reserve Act, assuming law was broken. Win, and the Fed at the least constrain them in the future and send a message to all central planners that they're not above the law. So, yes, if you look at the Federal Reserve Act, the original act, the Fed actually started out discounting commercial bills for the big banks. They were there to help the flow of trade in real goods and services. But with World War I, I think things changed, and they started buying government bonds. So I think we need to look also at all these emergencies we had, the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve was given a lot of powers by the politicians. And so now I'll just go on to some books that I think is really good for people to read and look into the Fed, to educate themselves. Because I think educating yourself about what central banks are all about and letting people know, that's a big part of cutting or curtailing the power of the Federal Reserve. And that's one of them is The Creature from Jekyll Island, of course. It's a classic by G. Edward Griffin. And he shows that, of course, the Fed was created by the richest man in the world. I mean, the Rockefellers were involved. J.D. Rockefeller at one point his net worth was 1% of U.S. GDP, which is amazing for one man. So these people have a lot of power. They've got the best lawyers. They've probably paid off a lot of the judges, unfortunately. They've got academia. They've got Wall Street. They've got all the economists. I mean, yes, I don't disagree that the Fed has created inflation. They have. That's the only thing the Fed does well, has done well since, let's say, World War I, is create inflation by allowing government to borrow as much as possible. But if you go to a court and say that they've created inflation, they'll take the PCE number or the CPI number and say, oh, the Federal Reserve has done a very good job since 1980. They've kept inflation under control. Where's your proof, Mr. Gammon and Mr. Barnes, of the inflation? So, yeah, it's not as clear cut, I would say. There's another banking act. I think it was the Banking Act of 1935 that changed the structure of the Federal Reserve. I'm not too sure because I haven't gone through the whole Banking Act. But what I think it did as well, this act, it retroactively made it legal for the Federal Reserve to accumulate government debt because when they started buying government debt during World War I, that wasn't supposed to happen, but they usually use big crises and emergencies to do things that they're not supposed to. So I think this Federal Reserve Banking Act of 1935, that's a problem. We've also got another problem, which is the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act. That was passed under the Carter administration in 1978. Have you noticed how the Fed chairman testifies before Congress twice? I think it's twice a year. That's part of this. The Congress of the United States, the legislative body, that of the United States, has passed into law this act that tells the Fed that they have to create full employment and stable prices. And it's been under these laws that the Fed has been doing what it's doing. Yes. And it's a machine, unfortunately, because they're together with Congress manipulating things, right? Manipulating the statistics. Of course, it's the government that, how can I say, publishes the statistics. But you can bet that they work together. The working group on financial markets, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve chairman, chairwoman, they all get together and they implement policy. They implement methodology for CPI, and it suits them. It suits the politician to pretend to the people that there's no inflation, that there's price stability, that there's full employment. They can keep creating this inflation and hiding it at the same time. So they can keep lining up their pockets, politicians, bankers, and the people suffer. So it's tough. I would say personally, the best way to fight the Fed and all other central banks is to try to deal with them as little as possible. Of course, there are legal tender laws. You have to pay your taxes in Federal Reserve notes or Bank of England notes. But what I mean by not dealing as much with them is by not holding a huge surplus of these, for example, Bank of England notes or even Federal Reserve notes. That's the only one I have. I'm in the UK. I got a $2 Federal Reserve note. Or a €5 note, or digital entries, of course, in your checking or current account with the bank. By doing that, you're financing all the central banks because all fiat currency is derived from the central bank. And yes, commercial banks, they create the currency that through loans, but the commercial banks are agents of these central banks. So I would say that that's one way to do it. Let's say if you have, if you win the lottery and you have $50 million in your bank account, I would have very little in there. I would take 99% of it out. Buy anything outside the system. Gold and silver are outside the system. Physical, of course. Buy land. Buy something that anything but paper, anything but in this financial market that is run by the central banks. I think that's a good way to fight them. Another way to fight them is to live within your means. And why is that? Well, because this system depends on people indebting themselves. They want to keep us in a debt spiral. So the more you borrow, the more business you're doing with the central bank. So I would say that that is the best way, in my opinion, to go about it. One of the ways, actually, not the best way. I think it's good, though, that this has come up. It just gives a bit more, it gives more awareness of what the Federal Reserve is doing. Is he going to be successful? He could be, but I'm not too sure. Bloomberg, they sued the Federal Reserve and they won. I think it was back in 2009. You can see here, Columbia Journalism Review. Bloomberg wins its lawsuit against the Federal Reserve. Score 1 for Bloomberg in its lawsuit seeking to force the federal government to disclose who it's bailing out with trillions of our dollars. Yes, the government has incredibly been trying to conceal that. So they were successful in that. But the other thing I would say, the Federal Reserve is very powerful. It's a hybrid, but it's really not federal, and it doesn't have any reserves, as the old saying goes. The regional banks are actually privately owned by the commercial banks in each of the districts. And then you've got the Federal Reserve Board, which is in Washington, D.C. That's more of a public institution. So it's tough. I mean, I remember a few years ago, Alex Jones was protesting near the Dallas Fed, and he couldn't get in there because it's a private institution. So they've got their property rights. So very difficult. So there is a silver certificate here, a United States Treasury silver certificate. You see, by holding these, you're not financing the Fed, but of course, this is not legal tender anymore. You don't get a $1 silver for it anymore, but you can see that it's different. This is a Federal Reserve note. This is a silver certificate. So there are other books, of course. There are other great books. Ron Paul's And the Fed. Ron Paul has been trying to audit the Fed for years, or when he was in Congress, he did try. I think others have tried as well. Another classic is The Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins. And another one that is about the bank that actually is in charge probably of the Federal Reserve is the BIS, the Tower of Basel, Adam Libor. I think the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and a lot of other central banks, they do their dirty, illegal work that they can't do in their national jurisdictions through the BIS, because the BIS, even though it's in Switzerland, it's like a sovereign entity. So we need to go after the BIS as well. GATA, for example, they've gone after the BIS. I think it was in 2000 to 2002. It says GATA financed the federal antitrust law of its consultant Reginald Howe versus Bank for International Settlements, which was pursued in the U.S. District Court in Boston from 2000 to 2002, while the Howe suit was dismissed on a jurisdictional technicality. It yielded valuable information at a court hearing in November 2001. So yeah, the jurisdictional there is probably because the BIS is sovereign. You can't sue the BIS, but it brought out information to the public. So that is a good thing. Let's hope it goes well. I might donate some to that GoFundMe, even though I think we need to keep fighting through educating the public, through informing the public. So when I started looking into this fiat currency system, into central banking back in 2002, it was very lonely out there. And then I started making my videos back in late 2015, early 2016. And I never thought I'd have so much interest in my videos, a few years later, like now. So I think it's incumbent upon each one of us to try to inform the public, friends, about the Federal Reserve. And that's why reading the books is important, so you can explain to your friends, family, what the Federal Reserve is all about. They might be interested, they might not, but they will start looking into it themselves. They will talk to friends. We need this network effect. With that, let's look at where the markets are this morning. It's 8:25 a.m. London time. We've got spot gold at 1686.60. The low was 1677. The high 1689. So what is going on with gold and silver? I mean, the physical, retail, and even wholesale market, there seems to be a lot of demand for, well, there is a lot of demand. The premiums are really high. Delivery times are really long. We've heard about the Perth Mint in Australia, even though some people say that in Singapore, for example, there's plenty of silver. What I think is happening, if you go back to the 1960s, when gold was banned from ownership in the US, you had what was called the gold pool. That's the major governments of the West manipulating, trying to keep the price fixed for the Bretton Woods system at 35. But eventually they couldn't do it anymore. And they basically instituted a two-tiered market where you had the free market in London for gold, where the price was free floating, and the official price at which the bankers dealt with each other, the central banks and the treasuries, which was 35. So I think that's what's going on. We've got a two-tier market. It's not official policy, but that's why I think it feels really weird to see gold trading at these levels, and silver as well, while if you need to buy gold and silver, it's a completely different price. The gold pool in 1968, of course, that failed. That's what led to the two-tier market. And then by 1971, all hell broke loose. The system collapsed. Gold went from 35 in 1971 all the way to almost 900 by 1980. So I think we're close to a juncture where they can't do this anymore. And you might think, what do you mean? You know, they've got all the paper to keep throwing it at the paper gold and paper silver. Well, when governments and monopolies try to control prices, especially government, when they put price controls on things, it creates shortages, and eventually the shortages will lead to higher prices. And it's the same thing for gold and silver. So right now, silver is at $24.15. It's up 12 cents. So they're holding on a little bit here. Are these paper prices out of the woods? I don't know. But I will keep trying to stack as much as possible, get outside their system. The Dow futures down 35. NASDAQ futures down 8, so stock market fairly quiet. S&P down 4. The currencies are a little stronger, about 1/8% stronger. Sterling is at 137.57. Euros at 117.34. Dollars continue to strengthen versus the yen. It's up 0.25% at 110.66. Dollars down slightly versus the yuan at 6.56. High grade copper up 0.5%. At $4 actually, and WTI crude is up 0.75% at $61. To finish off, the 10-year yield is unchanged at 173. I think we got to 177 yesterday, so it came off a little bit. Bond market not out of the woods. Today is the last day for the SLR exemption, so it will be interesting to see what happens in April with the bond market. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Please share it far and wide. Think about subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet, and you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and all these other platforms below here. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.